He came in before dawn, always before the recruits. Pushed a mop across the weight room floor like he'd done it 1,000 times. Hood up, eyes low. No one paid attention to him until one morning, a young SEAL candidate bent to tie his shoe and froze. Just behind the man's ear, under the edge of faded collar, was a tattoo, an old mark, nearly washed out. The kind only one group of men ever earned, and only after surviving something no one talked about. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten. No one knew his name. On the duty roster, he was just listed as maintenance civilian contractor. He wore the same uniform every day. Gray coveralls, dark blue hoodie, scuffed boots that never quite lost a reddish dust from somewhere out west. He showed up every morning at 0430 sharp. Always before the instructors. Always before the recruits. No one ever saw him arrive. He was just there, emptying bins, wiping sweat off mats that weren't his, cleaning mirrors no one thanked him for. The Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado had seen thousands of men pass through its doors over the decades. Some became legends, others became cautionary tales, but all of them had one thing in common. They remembered the facility itself more than the people who maintained it. The compound sprawled across 47 acres of carefully maintained training grounds, from the obstacle courses that broke bodies to the classrooms that broke minds. Every square inch was designed to transform ordinary men into something extraordinary. But transformation requires more than just intention. It requires infrastructure. Someone had to maintain the equipment that candidates used to build strength. Someone had to clean the mats where they learned to fight. Someone had to ensure that when 18-year-old kids from small towns across America showed up thinking they understood what hard meant, the facility itself would be ready to teach them otherwise. That someone was Hayes, though nobody called him that. Nobody called him anything. Really, he never spoke unless spoken to. And even then, he kept it brief. Morning. Copy. All yours. The SEAL compound gym wasn't like a normal gym. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was sacred. Every man who stepped through its doors knew that iron meant pain, and pain was a currency of transformation. Grunts, plates, and discipline filled the air. Candidates ran through circuits until their hands bled, and instructors pushed them harder than most human minds could comprehend. The facility operated on a rhythm that had been perfected over generations. 0430, facility preparation. 0500, instructor arrival. 0530, candidate formation. By 0600, the compound would be alive with the sounds of men testing their limits against equipment that had been designed to find those limits and push past them. And yet, every day, before the sound of chalk and steel took over, there he was, mopping, sweeping, restocking, disappearing. Most of the younger guys didn't even look at him. They were too focused on surviving the day. Hell Week was still months away for most of them, but the preparation for that preparation had already begun to separate the determined from the desperate. But some of the older instructors had noticed a few strange things. The way he folded towels, precise, tight, with corners that could cut glass. The way he stacked plates, always balanced by weight distribution, not just size, as if he understood that improper loading would throw off the entire rack system. The way he watched the new guys in the mirror, never staring, just observing like he was scanning for weaknesses that even the candidates themselves hadn't identified yet. Master Chief Peterson had been running training cycles at Coronado for 8 years, long enough to develop an eye for details that others missed. He'd noticed that the civilian contractor never wore headphones during his shifts, never had a phone visible, never seemed distracted by anything external. Most maintenance staff treated their jobs like jobs. Punch in, complete tasks, punch out. This man treated his work like a mission. He didn't wear headphones, never had a phone on him, and though he moved like a man with age in his back, there was something off about the way age sat on him. His knees didn't crack when he crouched to clean under equipment. His hands didn't shake when he lifted cleaning supplies. And when he picked up a 45-pound bar to move it from one rack to another, he did it with a grip that suggested the weight was inconsequential, handled with the casual efficiency of someone who had once been required to carry much heavier loads under much worse conditions. The morning routine never varied. 0430 arrival, always through the back service entrance that most people forgot existed. 30 minutes of preparation before the instructors showed up. Another 30 minutes of final details before the candidates arrived. By 0600, he would fade into the background so completely that most people would forget he was there at all. Recruits joked once that he was probably some burnout or reject. One even whispered that he applied years ago and washed out. Now he's stuck cleaning up after the guys who made it. But one of the older instructors, a former team leader named Mason who had 3 deployments and a Silver Star, had shut that down with a glance that could stop conversation mid-sentence. Mason was tough, quiet, and not prone to nonsense. He had the kind of reputation that made smart people listen when he spoke and made stupid people reconsider speaking at all. But even he didn't look the janitor in the eye when he passed. Not out of disrespect, but out of something that felt almost like deference, though he couldn't have explained why if asked. The base had seen hundreds of civilians over the years, kitchen staff, drivers, contractors, administrative personnel. Most lasted 6 months, maybe a year if they were particularly well suited to the environment. The hours were brutal, starting before dawn and ending after most people had gone to bed. The security requirements were intrusive, background checks that went back generations, psychological evaluations that probed into corners of the mind most people prefer to keep private. Most couldn't handle the environment. The constant tension of men pushing themselves to their absolute limits created an atmosphere that civilians found overwhelming. The language was harsh. The standards were unforgiving, and the margin for error was measured in lives rather than performance reviews. Except him. He never complained, never took a day off, never got in anyone's way, never required supervision or correction. His work was consistently excellent, completed without fanfare or recognition. He seemed to understand instinctively that his role was to enable others to excel, not to seek excellence for himself. The only detail anyone ever remembered was this. He always kept the hood up, even indoors, even in July when the California sun turned the compound into an oven. Even when sweat soaked through his coveralls and his face flushed red with heat, the hood stayed up, shadowing his face and concealing whatever he didn't want others to see. But one morning in the middle of summer, just after a brutal weight circuit that had left 3 candidates puking in trash cans and 2 more questioning their life choices, a recruit named Dawson collapsed onto a bench. The kid was 19 from Ohio, built like a linebacker, but carried himself like someone who was beginning to understand that size meant nothing without character backing it up. He leaned forward to catch his breath, sweat dripping onto the rubber matting, and glanced sideways at the janitor who was methodically wiping down the nearby floor. The movement was routine, practiced, but something about the angle caught Dawson's attention. The hood had slipped just enough to expose a patch of skin behind the ear, tanned and weathered like leather left in the sun, but marked with something that made Dawson's breath catch. A tattoo. Not large, not colorful, barely visible under the collar line, but unmistakably present and unmistakably specific. Dawson stared at it, blinking sweat from his eyes, trying to process what he was seeing. It wasn't a biker symbol. No skulls or flames or intimidating imagery designed to project toughness. It wasn't tribal art or patriotic symbolism or any of the decorative ink that young men collected to mark their passage through life. It was military, very specifically military, and not just any military marking. A trident piercing a skull, small, precise, executed with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested it had been earned rather than chosen. The kind of tattoo that only one group of men ever wore, and only after surviving something that separated them permanently from everyone who hadn't survived it. The kind of ink that no one outside those operations would ever have or dare to wear, because wearing it without earning it was not just stolen valor. It was sacrilege. He didn't say anything at first. The moment felt too surreal, too impossible to process immediately. He just watched as the janitor straightened, adjusted his hood with a practiced motion that suggested this wasn't the first time it had slipped, and walked away, silent as always, mop bucket trailing behind him like nothing unusual had happened. But from that moment on, Dawson couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen, and neither could his sleep, which became fitful and interrupted by questions he couldn't answer. If what he'd seen was real, if that tattoo meant what he thought it meant, then the man who cleaned their gym was a man who had washed out of SEAL training. He was a man who had completed something beyond SEAL training, something that existed in the classified spaces between acknowledged operations and officially denied missions. Dawson didn't say anything that day. He wasn't even sure what he'd seen was real. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or his imagination filling in details that exhaustion had created out of nothing. Maybe his mind, stressed by weeks of training that pushed human endurance past breaking points, had simply projected something extraordinary onto something ordinary because it needed to believe that the impossible was possible. But the image stuck with him. The precise angle of the ink, the professional quality of the lines, the faded clarity that only came from years in harsh sunlight and harsher conditions. That night, alone in his bunk while his fellow candidates slept the deep sleep of the utterly exhausted, he pulled out his phone and began searching through forums he wasn't supposed to know about, communities that discuss operators and special missions and unconfirmed teams. Most of what he found was garbage, fantasy and speculation, and stolen valor merchants trying to build credibility on borrowed glory. But some of the images matched what he thought he'd seen. Not exactly, but close enough to confirm that such tattoos existed, that they meant what he thought they meant, and that seeing one in the wild was like spotting a ghost in broad daylight. Trident, skull, covert operations. The kind of marking that indicated someone had been places that didn't appear on maps, done things that didn't appear in after-action reports, survived missions that were classified at levels that required congressional oversight to even acknowledge they existed. The next morning, Dawson kept his eye on the janitor, not staring directly but maintaining peripheral awareness like he'd been taught to do when gathering intelligence on potential threats. He wasn't alone in this new attention. Others had noticed something different, a subtle shift in the atmosphere around the maintenance man that was hard to define, but impossible to ignore. The instructor started hesitating around him, not obviously, but with the brief pause that comes when someone realizes they might be in the presence of something they hadn't recognized before. The officers didn't rush him when he was working in their vicinity, allowing him to complete his tasks without the impatient supervision they showed other civilian contractors. And Mason, the former SEAL-turned-instructor, watched him differently now. Not cautiously, not suspiciously, but with the kind of measured assessment that one professional gives another when trying to determine relative experience and capability. Like someone measuring the distance between who they are and who they once served with, trying to determine if recognition was mutual. Someone finally asked a question. It was Grant, a big guy from Texas who had already washed out once and come back meaner, carrying the chip on his shoulder that comes from having failed at something you thought you were destined to succeed at. He made the mistake of calling out, half joking but with an edge that suggested the joke covered something less friendly. "Hey, old man, you ever do more than clean sweat off the floor?" The gym went quiet. Not completely. Men still lifted weights, machines still hummed, the business of training continued. But the conversational noise shifted, becoming more subdued, as if everyone had collectively decided that this moment required more attention than their individual workouts. The janitor didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the comment, didn't even pause his methodical cleaning of the blood-stained corner of the mat where two candidates had gone too hard on grappling and open cuts that required medical attention. Grant chuckled awkwardly, the sound hollow in the suddenly attentive space. "Guess not." And then Mason walked over to him. No rush, no dramatic approach, just a steady movement of someone who had decided that a conversation needed to happen. No yelling, no threats, no public confrontation. He just leaned in close to Grant and whispered something that made the bigger man's face go pale and his mouth snap shut with an almost audible click. Later, when asked, Grant would never repeat what Mason had said. But he never made another joke about the janitor, never questioned his presence, never spoke to him again unless absolutely necessary for some functional reason. And when new candidates arrived and started making their own jokes about the quiet maintenance man, Grant would shut them down with the same kind of definitive authority that Mason had used on him. That changed everything. Word spread quickly after that. The way information moves through closed communities where everyone knows everyone and secrets are both currency and liability. Quietly, some started calling him the Ghost. Others just referred to him as Sir without knowing exactly why. The title emerging from some instinctive recognition of authority that transcended rank or official position. He never responded to any of it. The new attention, the changed atmosphere, the subtle shift in how people moved around him, none of it seemed to affect his routine or his demeanor. But his presence changed in ways that were hard to quantify. He was still silent, still early, still invisible by intention and routine. But now people noticed the invisibility itself, recognized it as a choice rather than a circumstance. He moved like he was mapping the room every time he entered it. Eyes always tracking exits, potential weaknesses, defensive positions. The kind of spatial awareness that comes from years of operating in environments where not noticing the right detail at the right moment means not going home. Some of the more observant candidates claimed he knew who was going to wash out before the instructors did, that he could read failure in posture and determination in the way someone gripped equipment. And then one afternoon, something happened that no one could ignore, something that transformed speculation into certainty and changed the way everyone on the compound understood their reality. The fire alarm went off during a weight circuit. Not a drill, but a legitimate emergency triggered by a tech malfunction in one of the new control panels that had been installed as part of a facility upgrade. Faulty wiring had begun smoking, setting off sensors throughout the building and triggering an evacuation protocol that required everyone to exit immediately and report to designated assembly areas. Most recruits jogged out in good order, following procedures they drilled dozens of times. Some instructors followed, maintaining accountability and ensuring that evacuation procedures were being followed correctly. But one trainee, Simmons, collapsed midway through the exit route. An old knee injury that he'd been managing quietly for weeks, worsened by dehydration and the accumulated stress of training, finally gave out completely, locking up his entire leg and dropping to the floor in a heap. Two of his fellow candidates went back for him, but they froze near the entrance as smoke from the faulty wires began to cloud the hallway, creating visibility problems and triggering their self-preservation instincts. The smoke wasn't immediately dangerous. No fire, no toxic fumes, just enough electrical burning to set off alarms and create confusion. But it would have taken a medic team at least 5 minutes to arrive, assess the situation, and execute a safe extraction. The janitor took 30 seconds. He walked straight into the smoke without hesitation, without protective equipment, without backup or communication with emergency services. Just a damn towel wrapped around his mouth and nose, and the kind of calm purposefulness that comes from having walked into worse situations with less preparation and better reasons. He carried Simmons out on his back. Not a drag. Not an assisted walk. Not the kind of awkward evacuation that untrained people attempt when adrenaline overrides technique. A clean, perfect fireman's carry, one arm locking Simmons' leg behind the knee, the other across his shoulder, controlling balance and weight distribution like he'd rehearsed this exact scenario hundreds of times under conditions where getting it wrong meant people died. Simmons was 215 pounds of solid muscle, unconscious weight that would challenge even trained individuals under ideal conditions. The janitor didn't grunt once, didn't strain, didn't show any sign that the load was anything more than routine. When he emerged from the smoke, eyes red but steady, breathing controlled despite the exertion, he laid Simmons gently on the mat outside and stepped back without a word, already fading into background as emergency personnel arrived. The fire chief arrived moments later with a full response team. They cleared the building methodically, confirmed that the situation was contained, and restored normal operations within an hour. All safe, all fine, minimal damage to equipment, and no injuries requiring hospitalization. No one talked about the extraction afterwards. Not officially. No report mentioned the civilian contractor, who had performed a textbook rescue under conditions that would have challenged trained emergency responders. But everyone saw it. The precision, the calm, the reflexive competence that comes from having done similar things under much worse conditions. The kind of performance that doesn't come from reading manuals or attending training courses, but from experience earned in places where getting it right the first time is the only option available. And later that evening, as Dawson walked past the janitor's car on his way to evening chow, he noticed something new. A small patch sewn inside the front pocket of the coveralls. Barely visible unless you knew where to look and took the time to look carefully. Black thread on black fabric. Letters so faded they were almost invisible, but clear enough if you had good eyes and strong motivation to see what was actually there. SD-6. SEAL Team 6. The most classified unit in naval special warfare. The kind of organization that doesn't officially exist, doesn't confirm membership, doesn't leave paper trails that curious researchers can follow years later. The kind of unit that disappears men when they retire, if they retire, making them into ghosts who continue to serve in ways that can never be acknowledged or honored publicly. And suddenly, everything made sense. The competence, the situational awareness, the way he moved through a facility like someone who understood its purpose at a level deeper than architecture or function. He wasn't a maintenance contractor who happened to work at a SEAL training facility. He was a SEAL who happened to be working maintenance, staying close to the community that had defined his identity and continuing to serve in the only way available to someone whose official existence had been classified out of the public record. The next morning, everything felt different. Not because anyone made announcements or held meetings or formally acknowledged what everyone now understood, but because no one did. There were no jokes, no half glances, no questions whispered in locker corners. Just a quiet shift in energy, like the room had decided to recalibrate itself around someone they'd all misjudged, someone whose presence among them was both more important and more dangerous than they'd realized. The janitor still came in at the same hour, still swept the same stretch of rubber flooring, still emptied the same trash cans, still maintained the same equipment with the same meticulous attention to detail. But now people stepped aside when he passed, not out of fear or intimidation, but out of something deeper and more respectful. The kind of deference you show to someone who has earned the right to walk quietly among warriors without having to prove he belongs there. Mason watched closely. He'd been quiet since the fire alarm incident, processing what he'd witnessed and trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew about the civilian contractor who had been part of the facility's background for years. He hadn't approached the janitor directly, not yet, but that morning, as the recruits finished their warm-up sprints and moved into strength training rotations, he walked over to the supply closet, where the janitor usually disappeared for 10 minutes during each break. He knocked once, not to announce his presence, but to request permission to enter a space that wasn't officially his. Then he opened the door and stepped inside. The janitor was sitting on an overturned bucket, drinking black coffee from a dented thermos that looked like it had seen more deployments than most people see countries. He looked up slowly when Mason entered, eyes calm and unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile. Just measuring, the way men do when they're trying to determine whether a conversation is going to be helpful or problematic. Mason didn't sit down. He just stood there for a moment, choosing his words carefully, trying to find the right balance between respect and curiosity. Finally, he spoke. I was in Kandahar, 07 to 08. Worked with some unconventional units during that deployment. You were in that unit, weren't you? The janitor didn't answer immediately, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't give any visible indication that the question had registered as anything more significant than a comment about the weather. But something in his stillness suggested that Mason's guess had landed closer to the truth than random speculation would account for. Mason nodded once, like that silence was all the confirmation he needed to proceed. There was a story that made the rounds during that deployment, he continued, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the small closet. A black site outside Helmand Province. Rescue operation. Zero intel going in, no air support available. Communications completely compromised. 2 men went in to extract a high-value asset. Only one came out. The janitor continued to stare at him, expression unchanging. But Mason thought he detected something. Not recognition exactly, but the kind of attention that comes when someone hears their own story being told by someone who wasn't there to witness it. They said the one who made it back carried the other guy half a mile under fire, through terrain that wasn't supposed to be passable by foot, stitched his own leg with a combat knife when he couldn't stop the bleeding, administered field medicine to an unconscious teammate, and managed to reach the extraction point 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Mason paused, watching for any reaction, and then he disappeared before the debrief. No name in the official report, no medal ceremony, just gone like he'd never been there at all. A long pause, the kind of silence that stretches between people when important things are being considered, when words carry weight that goes beyond their literal meaning. Finally, the janitor spoke, his voice calm and low, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume to command attention. You shouldn't ask questions you don't want answered. Mason didn't smile, but something in his posture relaxed slightly. That's what I thought. He turned to leave, but paused at the door, hand on the frame. They think they're learning discipline in that gym. Physical fitness, mental toughness, teamwork. But you're teaching them something else, aren't you? Something none of us can put on a whiteboard or include in a curriculum. The janitor looked down at his boots, worn and scuffed from years of walking on surfaces that weren't designed for comfort. They'll need it if they ever see what I've seen. And just like that, Mason was gone, leaving the janitor alone with his coffee and his memories and the weight of responsibilities that would never appear in any job description. Word didn't spread, not the way gossip spreads, with excited whispers and exaggerated details. But something changed in the days that followed, a subtle shift in atmosphere that everyone felt but no one discussed openly. It was as if the entire facility had collectively agreed to acknowledge something without naming it, to honor something without celebrating it. One morning, a group of instructors arrived early to find the janitor's locker door slightly open, not carelessly, but intentionally, as if he wanted someone to see what was inside. A folded American flag, creased from years of careful storage. A single pair of desert combat boots, worn smooth in places that suggested thousands of miles walked in conditions most people never experience. And an old Navy Challenge coin resting on top of a worn name patch that read simply, Hayes. No first name, no rank designation, just 5 faded letters that gave him something to call him besides Sir or the janitor. Not that anyone used the name directly. It felt too personal, too much like an intrusion into privacy that he'd maintained carefully for years. But knowing it changed something, made it more real, more human, while simultaneously making his presence among them feel more significant. That afternoon, Dawson finally gathered enough courage to approach Hayes while he was coiling a battle rope for storage, methodically working through a familiar routine that kept equipment ready for the next group of candidates who would use it to test their limits. Sir, Dawson said quietly, the title coming naturally now, carrying respect that had nothing to do with official rank structure. If you were really one of them, why are you here? Why this job? Hayes didn't stop coiling the rope, didn't look up from his work, but his answer came without hesitation. Because this is where they need me. Dawson waited, hoping for more explanation, but none came. Finally, he found the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him for weeks. Why not tell anyone? Why not let people know who you are? Hayes finally looked up, meeting Dawson's eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. His expression was neither harsh nor kind, just matter of fact, like someone stating an obvious truth that shouldn't require explanation. The day you need to tell people who you are is the day you've already forgotten. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen too many cleanings to ever be truly clean again, and walked away without another word. Dawson never asked again, but that night he stared at the trident patch in his locker a little longer than usual, trying to understand what it really meant to earn the right to wear it. And when he went to bed, he slept knowing that the man sweeping the mats and cleaning the mirrors might be the last line of connection between their world and a world that exists in the classified spaces between acknowledged operations and officially denied missions. A world where men like Hayes disappeared into backgrounds and legends, continuing to serve in ways that could never be measured or honored publicly. From that day forward, no one called him the janitor anymore. Not out loud, at least. He was still listed that way in the duty roster, still punched in on the civilian contractor time card, still signed equipment requests and maintenance reports with a name that no one dared repeat without lowering their voice. But around the compound, in the minds of every recruit and instructor who had caught even a glimpse of the tattoo on his neck or the silence in his stare, he was something else entirely. Hayes became part of the atmosphere, a quiet presence who moved through the gym like a ghost with purpose, never demanding anything, never interfering with training or instruction, but somehow always watching, always aware, always ready to step in when circumstances required capabilities that went beyond normal civilian contractor duties. Recruits began training harder when he was around, not because he said anything or gave instruction, but because his presence reminded them that they were preparing for something serious, something that would require everything they had and more than they thought they could give. They stopped complaining about cold showers, about sore muscles, about not making the cut fast enough. No one told them to change their attitudes. They just did, because in the presence of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything to carry forward, their excuses died quietly. One night after lights out, Dawson pulled aside one of the newer candidates, a kid from Montana who had been struggling with the mental aspects of training, and said quietly, "If you ever see him watching you, don't try to impress him. Just don't screw up." He's seen what happens when people screw up in places where screwing up means people die. The kid didn't understand yet, but he would. Eventually, they all would. Understanding came gradually, through observation and osmosis, through watching how Hayes moved and worked and interacted with a facility that had become his entire world. Mason, meanwhile, never brought up their conversation again. Not in briefings, not in casual discussions with other instructors, not in reports to his superiors. He didn't need to. The understanding between them was complete, requiring no further elaboration or confirmation. Once, during a break between training sessions, he left a folded note inside Hayes' supply cart. No signature, no identification, just 3 words written in careful block letters. "You're still serving." Hayes never mentioned the note, never acknowledged it directly, but the next morning the battle ropes were coiled tighter than usual. The squat racks had been disinfected and reorganized before anyone arrived, and the mirrors reflected training spaces that had been prepared with a level of attention that went beyond routine maintenance. The compound senior staff never formally acknowledged what they suspected about Hayes' background. No background check had turned up a military record that matched his apparent capabilities. No Navy personnel file matched his face or his skill set. But those who understood how special operations really worked, who knew that the most effective warriors were often the ones who didn't leave paperwork trails or official records, recognized the signs of someone who had served at levels that required complete anonymity as the price of effectiveness. One afternoon, a visiting commander from SEAL Team 3 was walking past the open gym doors when he stopped abruptly, stared at Hayes for a long moment, then whispered something to Mason that made both men go quiet for the rest of the day. Later, when asked what the commander had said, Mason would only reply, "Some questions are better left unasked." The gym kept running according to its established rhythms. Recruits kept sweating and bleeding and pushing themselves past limits they hadn't known existed. Instructors kept shouting and correcting and demanding excellence from young men who were learning that excellence was not a destination, but a daily practice. But every so often, when someone dropped a barbell without proper control, or slammed a locker door with unnecessary force, or spoke out of turn during instruction, Hayes would appear in the corner of their peripheral vision, just a second too early to be coincidence, just present enough to remind them that someone was always watching, always evaluating, always ready to step in if circumstances required it. And sometimes, in the rare, quiet moments before sunrise when the facility held its breath between night and day, Hayes would stop beside one of the mirrors and lower his hood, looking at the face staring back at him. The tattoo on his neck, once hidden carefully, now faded with time and sweat and years of carrying secrets that would never be spoken aloud, still spoke louder than any medal or commendation ever could. He never told anyone his story, never revealed his actual rank, never described his missions, never mentioned the names of teammates who didn't make it home or the operations that officially never happened. He just kept mopping the mats, coiling the ropes, scrubbing the blood and sweat from training surfaces, making sure that every recruit who passed through that gym understood that legends don't always stand on podiums giving speeches. Sometimes they push mop buckets at 4 a.m, silently ensuring that the next generation of warriors learns exactly what it means to serve something larger than themselves. The years passed quietly after that revelation. New classes of recruits came and went, some making it to the program, others discovering that wanting something badly wasn't the same as being capable of achieving it. But they all carried with them the memory of a man who never needed recognition, never asked for thanks, never demanded respect, because he had earned it so completely that demanding it would have diminished it. Hayes never wore a uniform during those years of quiet service, never gave formal instruction, never stood in front of classes explaining techniques or sharing war stories. He simply showed up early every morning, worked with the kind of precision that comes from understanding that small details can have large consequences, and disappeared into the background like smoke dissipating into air that had absorbed it completely. But behind that mop, beneath that hood, carrying that cart full of cleaning supplies and maintenance tools, was a story that no one could imagine in its entirety. A past that still stood watch over a place built for creating the strongest, the most capable, the most dedicated warriors the nation had ever produced. Because sometimes the men who have seen the worst of what humans can do to each other don't tell you what they experienced. They show you how to carry it forward, how to transform suffering into strength, how to take lessons learned in the darkest places, and use them to illuminate the path for those who come after. One morning, Hayes didn't show up for work. No call, no explanation, no prior indication that anything had changed in his routine. Just an empty parking space where his truck usually sat, a locked supply closet, and the kind of absence that makes people realize how much they had come to depend on someone they had never really noticed. The instructors waited. The recruits looked around, confused by a change in routine they couldn't quite identify. But the mat still needed mopping. The equipment still needed maintenance, and life at the compound continued according to rhythms that had been established long before Hayes arrived, and would continue long after he was gone. A week later, a package arrived at the facility, addressed to no one in particular, but clearly intended for the compound as a whole. Inside was Hayes' civilian contractor badge, his facility keys, and a single photograph. 8 men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, faces young and determined and marked by the kind of bond that comes from surviving something together that changes everyone involved. On the back of the photograph, in careful handwriting that several instructors recognized as Hayes's, were 8 words. Some of us made it home. All of us kept serving. No return address, no forwarding information, no explanation of where he had gone or why. Just a photograph and a message and the memory of a man who had walked among legends in training, teaching them through example rather than instruction that the greatest warriors are often the ones you never see coming and never see leave. The compound placed a small bronze plaque inside the main gym, mounted discreetly near the equipment storage area where Hayes had kept his cleaning supplies and maintenance tools. It bore no name, no rank insignia, no dates of service. Just 8 words that would remind future generations of SEALs what true service looked like, for those who serve in silence, still watching. Because some men teach through words, others teach through presence. Hayes never told war stories, never raised his voice in anger or instruction, never asked for acknowledgement or thanks. He showed up, did work that no one else thought mattered, and left more impact on the warriors he helped train than most instructors who spoke for hours about courage and dedication and the meaning of service. He never needed to prove anything to anyone, not to the compound leadership, not to the young men training beside him, not even to a generation that had forgotten to ask the right questions about the people who maintained the spaces where heroes were forged. But when someone finally looked close enough to see the truth beneath the sleeve, to recognize the significance of ink that had been earned in places that didn't appear on any official map, the silence that had protected him for years finally broke. And that's the thing about real warriors, the ones who operate in the spaces between acknowledged operations and classified legends. They don't advertise their capabilities or demand recognition for their sacrifices. They wait with infinite patience until someone is wise enough to notice the way they move through the world, the way they carry themselves, the way they don't need external validation, because they have already proven everything they needed to prove to the only people whose opinions mattered. Hayes didn't need a biography written about his exploits, didn't need a ceremony honoring his service, didn't need applause from people who would never understand what he had sacrificed in places they would never visit. All he needed was the opportunity to continue serving, to pass along through example rather than instruction the lessons he had learned in the darkest corners of human conflict. The recruits who trained in that gym during Hayes' years of quiet service would go on to become SEALs themselves, carrying with them not just the technical skills they had learned from official instructors, but something deeper and more valuable. The understanding that true strength doesn't announce itself, that real courage often looks like routine maintenance, and that the most important battles are often fought by people who never seek recognition for fighting them. Years later, when those same recruits had become seasoned operators leading their own missions in classified locations, they would remember the man who had mopped their training floors and cleaned their equipment, not because he had told them stories about his own operations, but because he had shown them through daily example what it meant to serve something larger than themselves without needing the world to notice or care. Some would try to research his background, attempting to piece together the fragments of his story from declassified documents and unofficial histories. But Hayes had been too good at his job, too careful about operational security, too committed to the principle that the most effective operators are the ones who leave no trace of their passage through the classified world. They would find hints, deployment records with redacted names, after-action reports that mentioned unidentified assets, commendations awarded to personnel whose identities remain classified for reasons of national security. But never enough to construct a complete picture, never enough to satisfy their curiosity about the man who had taught them more about being warriors than any official curriculum could have provided. And perhaps that was exactly as Hayes had intended it. Perhaps the lesson itself was in the mystery, in the understanding that some service is so important that it must remain invisible, that some sacrifices are so significant that they can only be honored through silence, that some warriors are so effective that their very existence must be denied in order to preserve their ability to continue serving. The plaque in the gym became a tradition for new classes of recruits. Instructors would point out during facility orientation, explaining that it honored someone who had served the compound in ways that couldn't be fully disclosed, someone whose presence had made their training possible and whose absence reminded them that service takes many forms, not all of them visible or acknowledged. For those who serve in silence, still watching, 8 words that contain entire careers' worth of dedication, sacrifice, and commitment to ideals that transcended personal recognition or reward. 8 words that reminded every man who read them that somewhere in the world, people like Hayes continue to serve in ways that would never make headlines, never generate accolades, never be celebrated in public ceremonies. But their service continued nonetheless, in maintenance closets and supply rooms, in background positions that enabled others to excel, in the quiet spaces where legends chose to fade into useful obscurity rather than retire into irrelevant comfort. The gym itself seemed different after Hayes left, though no one could quite articulate how or why. The equipment was maintained just as well by his replacement, a competent civilian contractor who arrived on time, performed his duties professionally, and departed at the end of each shift without incident. But something indefinable had been lost, some quality of attention and care that went beyond professional obligation into the realm of personal mission. New recruits who had never known Hayes sometimes reported feeling watched during their training, as if someone unseen was evaluating their performance, measuring their commitment, determining whether they possessed the qualities necessary to join the ranks of warriors who had trained in that same space. Instructors would smile at these reports, understanding that some presences linger long after the people who generated them have moved on to other forms of service. Mason, who had shared that single conversation with Hayes in the supply closet, became something of an unofficial keeper of the story. Not that he told it often or completely. Operational security and personal respect both demanded discretion. But when new instructors arrived, when visiting dignitaries toured the facility, when circumstances seemed to require it, he would share carefully edited versions of what he had witnessed. "We had a maintenance contractor here for several years," he would say, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that saying too much could be as problematic as saying too little. Former military, very experienced, very professional. He taught us some things about what service really looks like when no one is watching to give you credit for it. And that would be enough. The people who needed to understand would understand. The people who didn't need to know would be satisfied with the general outline. And the memory of Hayes would continue to serve its purpose, reminding everyone who encountered that excellence often wears coveralls and carries mop buckets, that legends sometimes choose invisibility over recognition, and that the most important work is often performed by people who never ask for acknowledgement. The tattoo on Hayes's neck, the one that Dawson had glimpsed during that pivotal morning, had told a story that Hayes himself never needed to tell. In the specialized world of military ink, symbols carry weight that goes far beyond their visual impact. They represent not just membership in elite units, but survival of experiences that fundamentally change the people who undergo them. That particular tattoo, the trident piercing the skull, was not something that could be researched online or replicated by civilian tattoo artists. It was earned through participation in operations that existed in the classified spaces between acknowledged military actions and officially denied covert missions. The kind of operations where success was measured not by public recognition, but by the absence of public awareness that they had ever occurred. Men who wore such marks had volunteered for assignments that offered no guarantee of survival, no promise of recognition, no assurance that their sacrifices would ever be acknowledged by the people they served. They had walked into hostile territory with minimal support, completed missions that required capabilities beyond normal military training, and returned home to silence rather than celebration. And when their official service ended, if they survived long enough to retire rather than disappear into classified casualty reports, they faced a choice that most people never have to consider. They could attempt to reintegrate into civilian society, trying to find meaning and purpose in normal occupations that would never provide the sense of mission they had known in the shadows. Or they could find ways to continue serving, using their skills and experience in support roles that enabled others to excel while keeping them connected to community that had defined their identity. Hayes had chosen service, choosing invisibility over recognition, choosing to enable others rather than seeking personal advancement. In doing so, he had found a way to remain true to the values that shaped him during his years in the classified world, while contributing to the development of the next generation of warriors who would face similar choices in their own time. The morning Dawson first glimpsed that tattoo had been a turning point not just for the compound's understanding of who Hayes really was, but for Hayes himself. After years of successful invisibility, of serving without recognition or acknowledgement, someone had finally seen past the carefully maintained facade to the reality beneath. Rather than compromising his position or forcing him to abandon his chosen role, that recognition had paradoxically freed him to serve more effectively, no longer needing to hide completely. He could allow glimpses of his true capabilities to show through, could provide guidance and example that went beyond routine maintenance, could teach lessons that official curricula could never include. The fire alarm incident, when Hayes had carried Simmons to safety with textbook precision, had not been an aberration or a moment of forgotten training reasserting itself. It had been Hayes allowing his true self to show through just enough to accomplish what needed to be accomplished, knowing that the cost of exposure was worth paying if it meant saving someone who might not have made out otherwise. And in the days that followed, as understanding of his background spread to the compound, Hayes had continued to serve with the same quiet dedication, but with a subtle shift in approach. No longer completely invisible, he became a presence that people noticed and respected, a living reminder that expertise and dedication could take forms that had nothing to do with official rank or recognized authority. The conversations he had with Mason, with Dawson, with others who approached him with questions or curiosity, had been carefully calibrated to provide just enough information to satisfy legitimate interest while maintaining the operational security that protected both his past and his present. He had shared what could be shared, acknowledged what could be acknowledged, and left the rest in the classified silence where it belonged. When Hayes finally departed from the compound, leaving behind only that photograph and those 8 words of explanation, he had completed a form of service that most people would never understand or appreciate. He had spent years of his life maintaining the spaces where heroes were trained, teaching through example rather than instruction, serving without recognition or reward because service itself was its own justification. The photograph he left behind, 8 men in desert camouflage, young and determined and bound together by shared experience, was both a memorial and a message. A memorial to teammates who hadn't made a home, whose names appeared on classified casualty lists that would never be made public, whose sacrifices would never be honored in ceremonies that their families could attend. But also a message to the men who had trained in that gym during his years there, a reminder that service takes many forms and that the bonds forged in training would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Some of them would face the same choices Hayes had faced, would have to decide whether to fade into civilian obscurity or find ways to continue serving in whatever capacity remained available to them. Some of us made it home. All of us kept serving. 8 words that captured the essence of what it meant to be part of community that transcended official military structure, that continued to exist in the spaces between acknowledged operations and classified legends. A community of people who had volunteered for the hardest assignments, who had survived experiences that changed them permanently, and who continued to serve even when their service could never be publicly acknowledged or rewarded. The bronze plaque mounted in Hayes' memory became more than just a tribute to one man's service. It became a symbol of the invisible infrastructure that made elite military units possible. The network of former operators, support personnel, and dedicated civilians who continued to contribute to military effectiveness long after their official service had ended. New recruits would read those 8 words. For those who serve in silence, still watching, and wonder about the story behind them. Some would ask questions, seeking details that couldn't be provided. Others would understand instinctively that some stories were better left untold, that some service was honored more completely through silence than through exposition. But all of them would carry forward the lesson that Hayes had taught through his years of quiet service, that true warriors don't always wear uniforms, don't always hold official positions, don't always receive recognition for their contributions. Sometimes they push mop buckets and clean equipment and maintain the spaces where others train to become the heroes that the nation needs. And sometimes, when circumstances require it, they step out of the shadows just long enough to carry someone to safety, to share a moment of hard-earned wisdom, to remind the next generation that excellence is not about being seen, but about doing what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, regardless of who notices or cares. Hayes had disappeared back into the classified world from which he had emerged, carrying with him the satisfaction of knowing that his years of service at the compound had made a difference in ways that could never be measured or quantified. The recruits he had watched train, the instructors he had quietly supported, the facility he had maintained with meticulous attention to detail, all of it had been preparation for missions and challenges that would unfold in the future, in places where the lessons he had taught through example would mean the difference between success and failure, between coming home and becoming another name on a classified casualty list. And in that knowledge, Hayes found the same sense of purpose and mission that had driven him during his years in the most elite units of the military. Service continued. Even when the uniform was replaced by coveralls, even when the battlefield was replaced by a training gym, even when the recognition was replaced by deliberate invisibility. Because for men like Hayes, service was not a job or a career or a phase of life that could be completed and set aside. It was an identity, a calling, a commitment that transcended official military structure and continued in whatever form circumstances allowed. Whether carrying teammates through hostile territory or carrying recruits through smoke-filled hallways, whether conducting classified operations or conducting routine maintenance, the mission remained the same: to serve something larger than themselves, to enable others to excel, to ensure that the next generation would be ready for whatever challenges awaited them. The legacy Hayes left behind at that SEAL training compound was not measured in medals or commendations or official recognition. It was measured in the countless small moments when recruits pushed themselves harder because they knew someone was watching, when instructors paid closer attention to detail because they had learned from someone who understood that small mistakes could have large consequences, when a facility itself seemed to radiate the kind of quiet professionalism that comes from being maintained by someone who truly understood its purpose. And perhaps that was the most fitting tribute to a man who had chosen invisibility over recognition, service over self-promotion, mission accomplishment over personal advancement. His impact will be felt not through stories told about him, but through the improved performance of people who had learned from his example. His legacy would live not in official histories, but in the enhanced capabilities of warriors who had trained in spaces he had prepared for them. Some legends fade into memory. Others fade into the people they helped create, becoming part of the invisible infrastructure that makes greatness possible. Hayes had chosen the second path, and in doing so had ensured that his service would continue long after his physical presence was gone, carried forward by every person who had learned from his example that true strength often looks like routine maintenance performed with extraordinary dedication. The tattoo on his neck had told one story, of missions completed in the shadows, of teammates who didn't come home, of service performed in places that didn't appear on official maps. But the years he spent with that mop bucket and that supply cart had told another story, equally important, of service that continues in whatever form circumstances allow, of dedication that transcends official recognition, of warriors who choose to remain warriors even when the battlefield changes and the uniform disappears. Both stories were true. Both forms of service were essential, and both would be remembered in their own ways by the people whose lives have been touched by a man who understood that serving others was not just a job or a duty, but the highest expression of human purpose.